African media in the connected continent. I'm Donata Columbro, I'm a journalist from Italy. I cover technology and innovation issues mostly, and I also work for an organization based in Turin, which sends me very often to West Africa, where I run training courses on citizen journalism. I'm here with my guest to analyze and to bring a different perspective on the future, on the changing media landscape, bringing a different point of view other than the Anglo-Saxon or European one. Let me just present the speakers that are here with us in the panel. Justin Arestein is an award-winning journalist and media strategist who works with partners across Africa to help strengthen investigative reporting, while also helping media owners adopt new technologies. He serves as director and advisor on various media industry boards. He is also currently a consultant as a Knight International Journalism Fellow for the International Center of Journalists, where he advises on practical business models for mobile and digital publishing across Africa. He also advises Google on data-driven journalism. Amadou Matar Ba is the Chief Executive of the African Media Initiative, a pan-African effort aimed to provide the continent's media owners and practitioners with the tools they need to play an effective role in their societies. Mr. Ba is also a co-founder and chairman of All Africa Global Media, allafrica.com, an international multimedia content service provider, and the largest distributor of African news. Peter Cunliffe-Jones is the executive director of Africa Check, Africa's first fact-checking organization set up in Johannesburg in 2012 to promote accuracy in debate and media in Africa. He also worked for AFP news agency in London for many years. And Mark Kaigwa is the founder of Nendo, a strategy and storytelling consultancy for digital Africa. He has published 2 of the most influential African blogs on the past 6 years, African Digital Art and Afri-Innovator. He is a writer and professional speaker on technology and ambassador of the Sandbox Network in Africa. He is also reported as a Forbes 30 Under 30 Best Young Entrepreneur in Africa in 2013. So all the speakers, they have different backgrounds. They have different experiences. And when talking about the future of African media in the African continent, we were talking about the risk to generalize, to see one experience working for the whole continent, for the whole 54 countries. It's not always the way it works. There are many differences between regions and countries, but we agreed to summarize and to underline some common features. Talking about the future of media in Africa it means also to talk about the fast growing market of mobile connections and mobile subscription. Then Marco is going to give you some data on it, but I can say to you that for 1 billion of people living in the continent, there are at least 800 million of SIM cards. So that the mobile market is one of the fastest growing in the world. The internet connection in the houses is increasing. The possibility for people to have internet at home is increasing. So there are some changes that are equal or that are happening in the whole continent. So to start the panel with the intervention of the speaker, I will ask them to underline, to talk about those common features and also the trends they see in the futures for the African media, starting with Amadou Ba.
Good afternoon. Seems to be working. Thank you, Donato. You know, I just want to start by keeping a commitment, and that commitment is about 3 weeks ago. I was in Rwanda, and I went back 10 days ago. And one of the commitments I took there is for the next 100 days, wherever I am speaking somewhere about Africa or about media, you know, I'll mention Rwanda. Because in Rwanda, as we all know, for 100 days, starting on April 6, 1994, you had a massive genocide, which have killed over 800,000 people. Some people say over 1 million people. And one of the reasons why I accepted and committed to mention always Rwanda in my speaking, spots for the next, now I guess, 80 days, then 100 days, is that media played a role in that. I'm not going to be talking about specifically that topic, but I just want all of us to take this opportunity to have in the back of our mind, that commemoration which has been going on in Rwanda, which is then commemorating the 20 years of the genocide in the country. So there was my minutes of silence after I've just said that. Now, I, first would like to start by thanking the organizers. And, thank the organizers because it's important in a journalism festival, international journalism festival, to have, a window on Africa. And particularly in Western Europe. It's important because the reality is, in Western Europe, people don't know about Africa, although we're neighbors, right? So when you think about Africa, or the mainstream image of Africa, is that of Rwanda, as I mentioned earlier. It's also, that of Lampedusa. Italians would know what Lampedusa is. And it's like South Sudan, it's Central African Republic, etc. But that is, of course, that's part of the continental image. The reality of the continent is much more complex and much more, sometimes hopeful. And that's, I guess, what we are here also to share with you, which would be a different view of the continent. Now, as you mentioned, Donato, it's not easy to talk about Africa, because Africa is 54 African nations. Africa is more than 30 million square kilometers. So, the realities of what this thing we call Africa is totally complex. But in our field, in media, in journalism, there are some characteristics. I mean, there are some trends we can actually build on which can be helpful. And that's what I'm going to try to do, and basically try to set the stage for Mark, Justin, and Peter to talk about respectively what they do in their day-to-day work. So, first and foremost, I want to try to classify this as, in two basically huge buckets. One is, the constraints of the media landscape, and the second, of course, would be then the opportunities. What comes first when you think about African media landscape, which is almost a characteristic throughout the 54 African nations, is, in terms of constraints, you think about regulatory environment. What do we have on the continent? Do we have that space? Do we have, the mechanisms for a free, independent press to grow? And free and independent press to grow, when I think press, I also, in media, I think about all technology players, which I'm sure my friends and colleagues around this table would be expanding on. So first and foremost, you have that regulatory environment you need to look at. And common trend throughout the continent, and I call these, sometimes domino effects. If you take big nations, you take South Africa, you take Kenya, you take Nigeria, for instance. I mean, in all these three, quite frankly, when you look at the landscape in terms of regulatory frameworks, there are more to be, concerned about than to be hopeful about. In Kenya last year and earlier this year, we have a major change in, the regulatory frameworks there. In South Africa, still going on. In Nigeria, same thing. So, there are some questions to be into that regulatory framework, which needs to be addressed and worked on to try to be much more progressive and create a conducive environment in which private and independent media can grow. Now, a second constraint, and I guess this would be transversal and would be really common to many places. It's very often, because of the regulatory environments which are quite poor and not necessarily conducive, then media houses in general struggle to access capital they need to grow their businesses. Now, it's simple. If I'm a banker, which is part of what I did in the past, if I'm a banker and Peter comes to see me and say, well, I need a loan or a line of credit to grow my business, I look at his assets and I see that, he's operating in a country where what his assets, let's say he owns a TV station, he owns a newspaper, he owns a radio station, for instance, or simply he owns like an online, play. The first thing I see is, well, if I give him my money and then the regulatory environment is not favorable, if actually the government comes down hard on him, then I've lost my investment. So, and by doing that, if I'm a friend of him and the government sees him as an enemy, then I'm the enemy of the government. So, the lack of funding generally for the media environment makes it also, quite difficult to deal with. And that's something, we need to work on and we've been working on. And third, which is a little bit more difficult for me to talk about, it's really the ethics problem in the media landscape. And I'm sure Peter's projects, can probably, talk a little bit about that. But here is a situation. Around the continent, we have actually data which shows we have about 35 to 37% of the practicing journalists who have been to a J school or have been correctly trained on the job. These figures may be a little bit more now because they date back from 2007, 2008 when we were doing the research to create the organization I head now, which is the African Media Initiative. Now, when you consider that, and in addition to the fact that many media houses do not necessarily have the resources to sustain their organization and growth, then you have, a big avenue for corruption and a big avenue for journalists really to be paid to deliver in what they're trying to do. So that's another constraint. Now, all these three, and I can go on, right, but I'll just take these three constraints. Now, if you take all these three constraints, they're not just there, people staring at them and not doing anything. There are a lot of things which are being doing, particularly in the organization I work with, like on ethics and leadership, for instance. We developed in 2011 the first worldwide ethics and leadership guiding principles for media owners and operators. As we all know, the fish rots from the head. If the owner, is not doing what he or she has to do, if the owner doesn't have the highest ethical standards, then the journalists do not necessarily have the incentives to do so. So a second thing, constraint, which is the lack of funding. We've been working on, creating a solution to that. And maybe, Justin will talk about that because we have different mechanisms, including one in which he is spearheading, to try to get to media houses or individuals who have journalistic projects the monies they need to deliver actually some great projects that can be helpful to the African citizens. And in terms of regulatory environments, I mean, we engage with different governments. I mean, last year, for instance, we were in Ethiopia for 3 days talking about, a lot of issues, including press freedom and freedom of expression. So all these constraints, we're trying to do something about them, and I'm hopeful that as we go, some very good progress would be made in this. Now, in terms of opportunities, and I'll be very fast on this so that my friends here would talk more about it. But as in anything, necessity is the mother of invention. Coming from a very low base, it's almost easier to actually create, some things which can be helpful to citizens. Hence, like all this innovation drive you see on the continent, because again, necessity is a mother of invention. Now, we have certain characteristics throughout the continent, again. One is growing population. Africa is over 1 billion people, but in many countries, over 60, 70% of the population is less than 20 or 25. The average, the median age on the continent is about 18.5%. So this is actually, when you look at our industry, this is an opportunity. A second opportunity is, of course, while this population is growing, you also have the economies of the continent growing. I know in Italy or in France or in Western Europe in general, you look at the growth rate of the continent, almost every country, and then you're jealous about the growth rate. But again, it's coming from a low base, so it can go and grow a little bit fast. So that growth rate has made it possible for the emergence of a new middle class around the continent, and this is almost widespread throughout the continent. Another aspect, which is absolutely phenomenal, is that if you have, growing population, so a lot of young people, you have, economic growth rate, so, more and more resources around. What that does is that, these young people, with the growing technology which is happening, and with a little bit more disposable money, become more and more, innovative in invention. That's how today, easily you can boast about having at least 2 world award-winning innovations on the continent from Kenya, for instance, and I'm thinking about M-Pesa, and I'm thinking about Ushahidi. So, this is, broadly speaking, the landscape within, which, media is developing within the continent. Now, I'm a believer that we need to change some things. And I actually usually say we need to reboot journalism on the continent. And by rebooting journalism, you need 2 critical factors, which would be sort of like operating systems. And one of those is, of course, innovation. And the second one is ethics. And those are the 2 guiding principles for me for journalism, not only to be growing and striving, but also making the impact it has to make on our societies. So thank you very much.
Hi. So as you heard, my name is Justin. And I started out as a journalist in South Africa, and then I became a small media business owner with no funding. So I did it the commercial way, a startup. And currently I'm working with Amadou's organization and helping to try and foster innovation on the continent in terms of digital. And the kinds of things we do is we try and help African newsrooms leapfrog the mistakes that they're seeing happening up north, so that they don't have to go through the same pain that Americans and Europeans have in the media industry. But just to pick up on a couple of Amadou's comments, so Africa is this massive market that is growing. It's not just growing in terms of people and in terms of affluence, in terms of people becoming wealthier, although not wealthy, they have more disposable income, and sometimes for the first time they actually have disposable income on a day-to-day basis. But also access is growing. So access to mobile specifically is growing dramatically, and I think Mark will speak about that later on. And what this does is it almost creates a perfect storm, where people suddenly have a bit more money, they have access to affordable technology, and they've got access to affordable data. And the big thing for the media is that 80% of these people have never been media or news consumers before, not even old newspapers. The biggest app, I think it's one of Amadou's quotes, the biggest app on the continent is still radio. And it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous, that's where they get their content from. So it's largely an untapped market that existing publishers, but more importantly, from my perspective, new young media organizations can leverage and can start building their own viable markets and their own viable media in. So how do we do that, sir? We try and, because there's this development lag between Africa and most of the developed north, we try and tell people that that's, in this case, a big advantage. We can see what went wrong in the US and in Europe with largely advertised-based revenue models, and we can try and tell people to immediately start, firstly, diversifying, and if you're starting a media company, to start building unique content that you can repurpose after publishing and turn that into additional revenue streams. Where we're working with established media, we're showing people how to mine their archives that in some places like Kenya go back for 100 years. And because there's so little public data available, unlike Europe or America, suddenly the fact that the media is sitting on verified, unique content becomes a major selling point, and they've got inventory that they could reuse. So we do this through three lenses that we try and get people to think about, and it's not because we've invented them, but because we've seen that the early pioneers who are making a good run out of, or good money at least, out of growing digital markets have stumbled on these principles. Firstly, don't do journalism just for the sake of doing journalism. Do citizen-focused, demand-driven, and outcomes-based reportage. So try and go in there and do the obvious things that we know media are supposed to do, but in Africa at least very few media do, which is just going and asking audiences what creates the pain, the most pain in their lives. What keeps your readers or your viewers awake at night and gets them worrying about their future? And then try and do journalism that helps them answer those challenges. And the journalism is just the first step. Once you've done the journalism, we work with the newsrooms and show them how to build news tools that can solve some of those. So just flip to the next slide. And the kinds of tools that we build, thank God, because in Africa we don't have very good bandwidth, we've prevented from doing kind of data pornography, from doing data journalism that creates just very pretty pictures. So we've been forced to try and experiment and invent with data journalism that you can deliver via SMS or text messaging to people. And at the moment what we're doing is we've created, through Amadou's organization, 2 or 3 different funds that gives away a fair amount of money. We've got an innovation fund that gives away $1 million a year for startups in the space. We've got a story fund, and that focuses on building tools and technology. We've got a story fund that gives away in the region of about $500,000 a year for people to use these tools. And then we've got smaller like Kickstarter funds for people who don't apply for competitions but are doing very interesting things. At the moment, we're supporting 90 projects. Everything from newsrooms experimenting with drones, camera drones, through to doing a lot of the very normal data and digital journalism you see in Africa, through to doing and pioneering fields like fact-checking, like Peter's project in Africa, and then people doing slightly more kind of experimental initiatives. Next slide, please. And some of those initiatives include trying to figure out what role does a future media play in a landscape where everyone is, or every company and every individual is effectively a media organization on their own. So it's how do you reinterpret what a newsroom does? Does it facilitate access? Does it provide people with solutions, which is non-traditional journalism, in terms of do you provide people with tools and do you almost kind of skirt that line of advocacy? Or do you help them connect with each other? And some of the tools that we are having some of the greatest success with are tools that, next slide, that help people connect not just with information and understand the story, but then take action based on that story. So this is an example of a tool from Ghana, where what we did was we scraped data for an investigative TV series around where the oil royalties, royalties from oil mining, where they really go. 3% of them are supposed to go back to the villages, to the local communities that are impacted. The money doesn't arrive there. So we did a normal traditional journalism story where we went and found that information by going to stock exchanges and company registrars around the world. But then we built a tool that helped people now, once they'd watched this television program on national TV, they wanted to find out, where do I fit in that story and what can I do about it? We built a very simple web tool as well as an SMS query tool that all you do is you put in your village name. It tells you how much your village is supposed to have been paid by mining companies. And then further down on the site, it tells you what government did with that money. Did they build a bridge or a school, or did they not? In most cases, they didn't. And then below that, it allows you to connect with other people in your village to potentially do something about this. So that's that kind of approach. Next one. Is replicated. So that was in Ghana. Right across the continent, we did a very similar approach again, SMS-based, data-driven reportage, and then with a data-driven tool that is accessible on mobile phone. This is in Kenya around the elections. Next one. This is also in Kenya around health services, everything from finding dodgy doctors to finding out whether you're being overcharged on medication, all accessible with text messaging. And then next one also with schools, and this is in, I think, Tanzania. We're doing this, and newsrooms are doing this, by investing into building innovation in their own newsrooms, but more importantly, creating a wider and cheaper community outside of their newsrooms. How and why do they do this? Because you're struggling to do this in Europe or in the US. Well, in Africa, as Amadou said, you're almost operating in a vacuum. So you're not fighting inertia. You're not fighting established kind of value systems or legacy media or infrastructure. Sometimes you're actually creating the very first version of something that's been out there. And as an effect, we've almost got an entire continent in many markets of early adopters, because you're not fighting people. If you show a good solution that people can use to make decisions that will improve their lives, it's a very difficult argument to actually get people not to use your news tool. It's common sense, so people adopt them very quickly. There's also very little static. So if you're doing something that stands out from the marketplace, you have an inordinate impact. All of those tools that I showed you previously were built for under $500 per project. And they all create infrastructure that can be reused repeatedly by those newsrooms, as well as repeated from markets, from country to country. The people who help the newsrooms create this are a largely voluntary community. We've built Hacks and Hackers chapters across the continent now. In 16 countries, we've got 30,000 news innovators who are participating in meetups, hackathons, and also in one-on-one projects with newsrooms. Those people are doing it because they're passionate, they believe in it. They're not doing it necessarily as contractors just for money. But built on top of that, the early successes are now actually building an economy where newsrooms and some of the early adopting media are realizing this is how they get ahead of the marketplace at least. So coming back to Amadou, who initially kind of painted a fairly grim picture, the picture from where I sit is very, very positive. What's the future of African media? We're almost starting with, in many ways, a clean slate. We haven't got media who've invested into 3 or 4 generations of websites. So the very first websites they're building are often not websites at all. They Mobi-powered, kind of, not really apps, but they're data-powered Mobi platforms. So almost platform agnostic in many ways. They're building tools as opposed to visualizations. And what they're trying to do is not just win market share, but they're trying to create ways that citizens or audiences can engage more meaningfully with their societies around them. And then as media, they then analyze and mine that engagement and feed it back into the news cycle. So from the core markets where AMI operates in Africa, which is at the moment we've got news labs in 6 countries, and we've got projects over about an additional 14 countries, so slightly over half of the continent with some kind of exposure. We're finding enthusiastic, aggressive adoption of these new tools, both by media publishers as well as by audiences. And we also, because of necessity, finding that people are doing very large impacts for very low costs. So they're almost learning how to iterate very quickly for very little money, purely because there aren't that many resources available. We'll be looking at some of the more detailed examples in some of the panels tomorrow.
Mark, if you're ready.
All right. Yeah, great stuff, Justin. So I think from my side, in terms of just contributing to the debate and giving a perspective, I definitely know that I'm sitting on the same panel as Peter here, who works for Africa Fact Check. So that my little disclaimer is that I don't, you know, I could probably give a couple references, but don't give me a hard time, Peter. So I think when we look at the whole African continent, I think, you know, billion for billion, we have a bigger middle class than China, fewer people than India, and the continent now is typically looked at as one large homogeneous area. But much like Amadou said, it's 54 different states, you know, and sometimes there's, you know, a lot of just real polar differences between some of them, sometimes when they're geographically seated next to each other. And there's that definitely doesn't go without saying. So that phrase, for some of you, it'll already have been driven to you a number of times, but Africa is not a country. And as much as we would try and present this big or a series of perspectives, this is just a fraction of what's really out there. And you know, it's the fastest growing mobile market, as Donata rightly said. It's also the world's most multilingual continent, and at just over 1 billion people. There's the hope that, much like Donata said, the mobile phone, and particularly how it's been used, that will become one of the single defining trends that shapes not only the media, but certainly society, technology, culture even, globally. Made in Africa will certainly take on new meaning in the months and years to come. Now, the first thing, you know, people think about when it comes to Africa, and granted, this is by benefit of global media coverage. I do mention some of the media stories that have come and become the world's headlines. It's you know, it's lions, diamonds, and war, right? So it's a beautiful savanna, and you know, you see an antelope being, like, you know, chased down, and you're like, yeah, Africa, got it. It's a beautiful, you know, chain or jewelry, and you're like, yeah, sourced in Africa. Or it's war, unrest, or hunger, or famine. So there's 3 very again, I'm being incredibly general here, but global media tends to skew more towards that side. Now, more recently, we've been quite taken by this new narrative of Africa rising, or if you like, you know, Africa, the connected continent, or Africa, the hopeful continent. And that last one, the hopeful continent, is or was the front cover of The Economist in 2012. And why that's important is because in the year 2000, and this is very well documented, The Economist had a front cover on their magazine that had a gentleman holding, in a very relaxed pose, he had an RPG rocket launch over his shoulder, and the title was Africa, the Hopeless Continent. Just the year 2000, just as far back as that. And 2012, we see the hopeful continent. 2013, we saw Aspiring Africa and a number of other Africa-centric covers that have all shown that the world is looking more towards a lot of the economics and big figures that are telling that this global economy is shifting towards places like Africa, and not merely just for extractive industries or natural resources, but economies. And I think, this has also been spoken of quite a lot, but 11 of the 20 fastest growing economies in the world today are from Africa. And in 2011, Ghana was recognized by the International Monetary Fund as the leading economy at the time. Now that out of the way, mobile, going back to that, that's as a theme, that one of these single things that's helped, I think even with Justin's work and certainly with Amadou's, really changed the game in terms of not bringing lessons and saying that we're looking into a crystal ball, what are the challenges that Italian media has had over the last 5 years, and let's stop it from happening. Mobile is that one disruptive game changer, and for Africa, that's been the case. So, I mean, if you look at, there's some research from the GSMA, the GSM Association. Africa was the #1 region where mobile was the greatest contributor to the economy. So it was 6.2% of the GDP last year. There's also Pew Internet Research who published some research in February of this year. And interestingly, Kenya, just to take an example, and Africa, again, I won't say Africa at large, but parts of Africa, or African countries are represented well. In terms of the population, the adult population that own a cell phone was at 82% for Kenya, for example. Just to give you context, Indonesia was at 78%, and Brazil was also behind Kenya. And South Africa was ahead of Kenya by a bit. And more people in Kenya own smartphones than Brazil, for example. So you still have African countries not only on the big, broad numbers actually showing that they're getting ahead, but even on the innovation side, where you do have particular distinctive companies and projects that have gained a global reputation. Now, what those do to the newsroom, or what those do to the audience in terms of increasing what you could call their own, let's say, functional literacy, their ability to perhaps not be even literate as we know it, but understand a sequence on a mobile phone with USSD, or if you're familiar with the *144, *122 messaging, similar things to that. That does change the entire expectation that would be placed on this audience now in future, and the hope is that this will only continue. I think I stand corrected, but I think it was AMI and Wanefra who showed, I think this was in 2012, the last time I checked, but that print continues to grow by and large in much of the emerging markets. I know in Kenya, in last year, for example, we had 2 new newspapers, launched in the country, and at a time when globally print is, a lot of people are chanting print is dead, or radio is dead, or insert name of media here is dead. When you look to the continent, I think it's more a media evolution that's happening than a revolution per se. And if it is revolution, it's revolution because of the mobile phone. Now, the work that I do in Nairobi is I run a company called Nendo, and we study and try to present such trends, specifically around strategy and storytelling for new media and the web. And we published just over a month ago a couple trends on where this is going. And there's really 2 I can focus on, which I think are of maybe a good deal of interest here and would set the tone for discussion. But there's 15 different trends, and it's a free report that's available for you to download. Now, perhaps I can get my slides going here. Some help with the slides? Are we up yet? All right. So that's us. That's the report. Those are my co-authors. And just real quick, right, natural language processing. We had to come up with a number of the tools ourselves to sift through social media, because a lot of the great technology made in Silicon Valley, in London, in Beijing, wherever it is, doesn't pick up perhaps on some of the colloquialisms of the way Kenyans or East Africans would express themselves. We got all of our data from certified Twitter partners. This is in case you check out the report. And there's three things that made, we feel, the last year probably Kenya's most significant, and Kenya leads the way in East Africa in terms of a digital year. One was the elections. So the 2013 general elections, even the candidates themselves distinguished themselves on the level of technology sophistication they had. So you had one candidate claiming to be the digital candidate, and obviously labeling his opponent the analog one. You had here some very sophisticated things around blogging and a number of. It was a big testing time or coming of age time for many innovations that had begun in the period between the last election and now. Ushahidi for one, and it was, can you actually use this technology to change the result of an election? Can you motivate or inspire or inform the electorate in a different way? And we saw a lot of lessons taken out of that. The Westgate Mall attack. This was the first time, I believe it is, in history that you had terrorists on one hand and the interior ministry of a country, so the security apparatus of a country, actually exchanging back and forth on Twitter as during the attack. So, you know, the attack is playing out at a mall, and online, you know, the minister of interior security and, you know, the Al-Shabaab terrorists are actually exchanging these barbs back and forth. Also to see the rise of citizen journalists who covered and were responsible for many of the images, tweets, updates, and you know, first responder information that happened during this. We learned an incredible amount from it. Kenya at 50, it was 50 years of independence, and this hashtag and much of what we learned from the celebration therein showed us quite a lot. Now, this is, I guess, the top line of what the trend report covers. 2014 will be the year where WhatsApp, the instant messenger WhatsApp, if you're familiar with it, changes the media, social TV transforms our screens, and the 47 Kenyan counties see social media devolved. But this is the one trend that excites us the most, and we've seen some great and interesting things since publishing this trend report at Nendo. One of the things around this that's been so interesting to see is people have always called on people to pursue these ideas around citizen journalism. So send us your pictures on Twitter, email us your images, and calling on people to install applications, brand new apps, sometimes made in-house, to put this expectation on the audience that they will learn how to use it, learn how to create a story, blog, publish it. And the powerful thing about WhatsApp, and really where it is now, which if you've been following the story this year, just over a month ago, it was acquired by Facebook for $19 billion. But just a few weeks ago, they announced that they had over 500 million monthly active users. So this is one of the main ways, and according to on-device research, it's the #1 way on smartphones that, in terms of like high frequency of an application, that people will message one another. It beat Facebook Messenger, which has well over 1 billion people, at least on Facebook. Now, why that's important is because for the newsroom in an emerging market, if you're looking to solicit viewpoints and most importantly, rich media, you know, WhatsApp is an incredible tool to do that. So when we published the report, we were looking at regional brands, regional ideas, but since publishing it, people from different parts of the world have sent over either news stories or ideas and apps and APIs that they're working on that use this to transform the newsroom. And so what you're seeing now, and there was one example is a Kenyan TV show. If any of you have been to Kenya, the roads are, you're going to spend a good bit of time on the road. And by that I mean in traffic. Because some people tend to drive, I won't call it aggressively, but I will say they'll definitely keep your adrenaline pumping. And there's really no way to report when another bad driver drives badly or doesn't drive very well. And so what this one media station did is they said, look, we know that the worst people on the roads are out there, and we want you to tell us who they are, so we'll shame them on national television, all right? And they said, you just use WhatsApp. So take a picture and send it to us. You don't have to say a single word. Just do that. And they have this very funny little clip. It's of a bunch of children saying, shame on you. Like, it's just that. And they do it over and over. And you've had diplomats' cars. You have had school buses that are carrying children. You have had matatus, which are our, like, minivan taxis. You've had all this range of people. But they get dozens and dozens and dozens of images and short videos of people breaking the law because the police, maybe it's too late for them to act, or this is finally a way for them to close the feedback loop on, you know, you spot something, but it's not worth you going to a police station to report that person, so you're going to shame them. But what they also ended up doing was really pushing out this call for people to experiment with WhatsApp. And if you've used the instant messenger, it lies, in terms of the scale of how sophisticated of a user you have to be, it lies far closer to SMS, which is how they market it to people. They say, look, it's like SMS, only on your internet data plan, and you don't have to pay as much. That's how they market it to people. So I don't have to understand what a retweet is. I don't have to understand what a hashtag is. I don't have to sign up on Facebook or anywhere else. I don't have to know what a like button is, but I can have that picture that makes it to the, I mean, who knows? In this day and age of where an Instagram photo can make, you know, the New York Times or many of these larger media players, WhatsApp, in our opinion, will be one of the single defining trends of the next 1 year. The second interesting thing is around mobile. Now, when we say mobile here, you might hear us and think, oh, well, mobile apps, or think iPhone. But in Africa, you are talking Android, and you're talking a very blurry line between a feature phone, which is a phone with very, very basic, very limited internet access, sometimes not even 3G, but the internet access is there. And in the case where they're trying to access a website like Facebook, Facebook have what they call Facebook Zero, which is mainly in emerging markets, which is Facebook almost zero rated by the mobile telecommunications companies. And what this allows people is to get used to that feeling of using Facebook on your phone, getting into a social network. And the more familiar you get with submitting content, the more they're banking on you will submit content to them, or you will consume their content on mobile, even as we expect the shift from perhaps traditional media to evolve towards this hybrid mix of traditional and new media. I'll close it out with an interesting story of a man people know as the tweeting chief in Kenya. So we have a very small, obscure-ish part of the country called Lanet Umoja, and there's a chief there. And by government order, he needs to congregate people, I mean, similar to what we're doing here, and speak to them and hear them every 2 weeks. One time, what he did is he came and he asked everybody to take out their phones, and he told them, send an SMS that has the following words. He said, with the words follow and a space and the word chief karaoke. He had all of them send this SMS. It was free for them to send it. What they didn't realize he had made them do, just by an experiment, was they had all subscribed to a free service in Kenya and many emerging markets that allows you to receive somebody's tweets without ever signing up for Twitter or ever even understanding the concept of Twitter. What this led to, it started off with just a few people like that, his family, his friends, and then each of them was to bring one person and get them to send this message. Today, when somebody, there's so many examples of this, there's a time where bees had attacked, there was a place where they had harvested honey, and there was a couple of students who happened to wander around. Bees attacked the school. He sent out one SMS that said, I need you to bring blankets and help protect the kids at the school. Hundreds of people showed up, because when he sends one SMS out now, one tweet, it goes out not only to his 20,000, 30,000 people on Twitter, but it goes out to at least 50,000 people in this constituency who don't understand what Twitter is. They just know when the chief talks to us, we get it from this number and we do it. So when there's a lost goat or a lost calf, or he needs chairs for an event, or even when somebody's getting robbed or anything like that, he's been able to take community policing to like an all new level and essentially become a media source for these people who are completely off the grid. So you won't see them listed in any follower list on Twitter, because to Twitter they don't exist. But there, that's a new kind of like almost dumbed down age of social media, where the phone is the beginning and end of it, but the principles behind social media mean it can happen in a place where you might not expect it, but you could certainly learn a few lessons from it. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Well, I'll try to be brief. After following my colleagues, we've been asked to talk about trends in the future of the trends that we see in the future for African media. And if I summarize to an extent what my colleagues have said, which they haven't actually said I can do, but I'm going to do anyway, the things that I see 4 primary themes. One is the growth of population and the growth of an economically wealthier population in Africa. 2 is the growth in the number and the variety of media houses. I lived in Nigeria from 1998 to 2002, and in many parts of the north of Nigeria there was the state-run radio, and that was it. Newspapers didn't reach the region, TV didn't reach the region, it was this one channel of radio. There's now a great variety of media accessible, and I think that picture carries across a lot of countries. Third theme that I see, after growth of audience and growth of the number and variety of media, is the challenges that Amadou talked about. The regulatory challenges that are certainly not going away, whether that's Nigeria or South Africa or Kenya or Ethiopia or elsewhere. The financial challenges. Again, if I go back to Nigeria more than a decade ago, the number of people I knew, Nigerian journalists I knew, who would come to me and explain that they hadn't been paid for 6 months, 7 months at a time. And that leads, as Amadou was saying, to obvious pressures that will corrupt the journalism that they would seek to carry out. It's very easy to be smug as a journalist whose organization pays your salary on the last Friday of every month, or whatever it might be, when you haven't been paid for 4 months, 5 months, and a tempting offer to put out a puff piece comes along your way, that's the way you pay your rent. So growth of audience, growth of variety of the media, numbers of media, the challenges that are faced, and in fact I was going to, on the challenges, regulatory, financial, the challenge of data, which from the project that I'm involved with is one that is particularly interesting to me, and I know interests I think everybody here. And a fourth challenge, which I talk about, is representativity. And that, in many ways, is at the heart of the citizen journalism that we've been talking about. It's as big, or it's a huge issue across traditional media. The number of women journalists that I know across the continent is far fewer than the number of male journalists. If you go to, I did a long study of the Nigerian media, so I know that best. I'll probably talk about that more than other countries. The vast majority of media organizations are based in one particular part of the country, and they look at national affairs with a perspective that comes from that part of the country. It's a common feature across many countries. So growth of audience, growth of the variety of number of variety of media, the challenges, and then the responses. And that's what I think Justin was talking about in general, and Mark in particular. I mean, if I explain, we were introduced earlier as providing a perspective that wasn't Anglo-Saxon or Western European, and I have to fess up, I'm not actually Nigerian. I've worked for many years for the AFP news agency, and now work for the AFP Foundation, and we are involved, as was said, in running a project that is based at the University of the Witwatersrand, the journalism department of the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, and is this year expanding, I hope, to Nigeria and to Kenya, and it's a fact-checking website. and in 2015 to Senegal. I'll tell you the details later. But so, and the logic behind, the reason that we got involved in developing this project is to try to recognize one of the challenges that we see and work with partners in areas around the country to provide a response. And the big challenge that we see is that as you get a growth in population, as you get a multiplication of the forms of media, you've had, and it's a real positive, you've had a massive increase in the flow of information. The negative side is that you've had a massive increase in the flow of misinformation. And I mean, over the last 20 years, the most obvious example of that and the harm that that can do is the thing that Amadou was talking about in Rwanda, where I mean, it's recorded history that there was a section of the media, a powerful section of the media in that country that took a very proactive role in promoting the genocide. There are, all across the continent, there have been flows of, and there are increasing flows of misinformation coming from all manner of sources. The real positive that we see in responding to that is that there is across, we find in the response to our project, a huge demand from journalists for examples of and tools to enable them to carry out, to check the claims that they report. One of the things that we're seeking to do, I mean, if I explain the project, it's a website, you can look at it online if you're online, it's called www.africacheck.org, all one word. It's on Twitter as AfricaCheck. We publish reports that take claims that people in the public space in South Africa initially have made, and we look at the evidence that supports and the evidence that undermines those, and we publish the results. We then make those reports freely available to the media to be republished. We make our researchers available to go on air because we're conscious of the fact that radio is the biggest app in Africa still, and so we want to get to an audience that don't go online. And by doing that, we're providing an example of what fact-checking is. But a lot of journalists know what fact-checking is, but with the way that journalists in Africa and elsewhere are having to work, life's busy, and where you used to be writing one article a day, you're now writing the article, updating the article, doing the blog, pushing it out on your Twitter feed, and so on. And so what we are seeking to do, and this goes to one of the points that Justin was making, is to build tools into the site for people to use, for journalists in particular to use, so that where they wish to, whether they're a journalist in West Africa, in East Africa, South Africa, to check the claims that politicians, the public figures, that business people, that NGOs are making, they can have a tool to enable them to do that, and advice and training and so on. But I mean, all of that, I think, I mean, that's what I'm involved in is one small project to try to tackle one particular problem that we see. The other issues that Amadou raised about the financial problems and the regulatory problems and so on, obviously there's a need for responses to those and for other responses to the ones that we see as well. So it's not a blanket hopeless continent or a blanket Africa rising story. It's like in most parts of the world, it's a pint glass half full and half empty at the same time. On which drinking note, I will stop.
Thank you for this first round of interventions. We still have 25 minutes, I think, 20 minutes, because we entered late in the panel. Each of you underlined the fact that Africa is a continent of early adopters of tools and media consumption in many ways. And thinking about my last experience in Burkina Faso, I've been there in 2010 and now in February 2014. And I've seen really a big difference of access to technologies. Many of my friends had internet at home in the capital. So many of them had access to information and to the media, to different kind of sources. The quote from Amadou about radio as the most downloaded app was from 2012, where we meet in Milan. And I don't know if it's still the same thing today. But the other fact, what you underlined with your intervention, is also participation, not consuming media as just a reader, but as users with power. So we can say, I don't know if we can say it, that the access, the increasing access to technologies, to social media, to the internet is also increasing democracy. We've seen many projects about elections, monitoring elections, also monitoring politicians and fact-checking. So the increasing access to technologies and to internet can increase democracy, but at the same time, Amadou just said this, he talked also about press, freedom of the press. In many countries, there are some threats to the freedom of expression. I'm thinking about Ethiopia, where right now there are 6 bloggers and 3 journalists in prison for having spoken against the government. And Ethiopia, for instance, is one of the countries which is using technology to monitor and to do surveillance on the way people talk about against the government. So if you can also do a small round of intervention on these two, on this duality, these two trends, how they can cope, the increasing democracy given the increasing access, but also the problem with the freedom of the press. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Donato. Look, it is a fact that, you know, technology is a tool for the best, and it also be the tool for, you know, the worst. The same time, you know, Mark, Justin, and Peter use these technologies to empower citizens so that basically there's a fundamental change in their daily lives, improvement happens. At the same time, you know, you have some groups, including governments, as you mentioned, which can use those to monitor. And all of that under the disguise or this big excuse that we live in a dangerous world. And of course we live in a dangerous world. I mean, whether it is in the United States, whether it is here in Italy, whether it is somewhere in Africa. I mean, our governments have some usage of the technology that, you know, we don't want to know. You know, or if we know, it's a complicated aspect. But one thing remains to me. It's that fundamentally, you know, there is a trend which is people's and citizens' empowerment cannot be stopped. And we have seen it time and again. On the continent, you know, I'm not going to refer necessarily to the Arab Spring, but something softer, which has happened in many other countries, where actually what happens is groups of people, citizens, using mobile phones or any kind of devices, empower themselves and force softly communities or governments to change. We've seen it in Kenya, we've seen it in Mali, we've seen it in Senegal, we see it across the continent. And I think at the end of the day, that's what's most important, and that's really what, you know, we all should work in to push so that we can empower the citizens. Governments would keep doing things we don't want them to do, and they don't want us to know. Yeah.
So just building on what Amadou says is that these new tools are enabling citizens to actually have a voice for the first time in many of these countries. And the media are realizing that in this new world where they have to find new relevance, they need to understand where their new place is as the business model for media changes. A lot of the media that we work with are finding that creating citizen engagement, if not the tools and the platforms for meaningful citizen engagement, is a new business model that they're able to grow both audiences and relevance around. So in Africa, the programs that we help fund are actually driving the open data movement right across the continent. So unlike in the US and in Europe, where open data is driven by transparency activists, in Africa, it's actually been driven by mainstream media, where they're helping digitize government records, open up government archives, and then build citizen tools around that through the Code for Africa movement, as well as through various other transparency programs. Now, that isn't replicated that we've seen anywhere else in the global north, but it is echoed if you look at Latin America, where, again, mainstream media have played a central role in helping redefine how citizens can engage with authorities. And those authorities aren't just governments, they're also very large corporations, which in Africa aren't invariably the media, but in Latin America can be often also, they're also part of large corporates. So these tools are being built by newsrooms to deepen audience engagement, but very quickly get spun out as citizen engagement tools that are owned and run by people who are not in the media themselves. So media are actually playing a lead innovation role there. So that speaks to democracy. Also, when governments do open up, they often, like in Kenya, dump a whole lot of very raw information out in the public space. And people struggle to make meaning or to kind of extract meaning from that. Again, media in South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria are playing a leading role in developing citizen groups who can analyze things like state budgets and contracting, who can analyze academic and school results and help drive a fact-based, evidence-based discussion, public discussion about public policy. Now, that hasn't happened before because there's a very weak, in very many of these countries, a very weak civil society sector. So the media is almost stepping into a gap there that it previously wasn't involved in. And by doing that, they're redefining what media does, if not what journalism does. So there are those two things. In terms of securing that space, the media in Africa are also helping pioneer encrypted channels and secure channels for exchange of communication as well as for discussion. And these are being rolled out often in partnership with civil society organizations, but in a lot of these countries in West Africa and in Central Africa, there are no civil society partners that operate in that space. So media is again helping to pioneer some of the kind of platforms as well as forums where people can engage.
I think maybe just add it. Democracy itself takes on, I think, new meaning, especially for African countries, given their let's say colorful history with even our understanding of the institution of democracy itself. So, I mean, Malawi is having an election right now, and in many African elections, especially that over the last, let's say, 4 years, to even give a cautious estimate, the role of the mobile phone in the electoral process of, especially whether it's voter registration or soliciting participation in the newsroom, in terms of SMS being a key driver that turns it into two-way communication at a very basic level. These are things which are actually having an accrued effect on society and on freedom of expression. Now, granted, you don't know, if you send perhaps a particular point of view, it's not to say that it will be published. It's still subject to an editor in that particular case. But maybe one point to note of how social media has changed things is like for Kenya, around the Westgate Mall attack, the Daily Nation ran a front page image, very grim image following that attack as it was going on. Now, ordinarily, you would send an email to the editor saying, I was perhaps offended by this image, or you would have people write in with snail mail with actual letters, or you would have people call in. What instead happened was people bombarded the CEO and the most senior officials who were actually on Twitter, and somebody began to try and share like their personal information. A man who's I can't call him an investigative like blogger or anything. He's a very divisive guy. But people were basically able to completely flood this organization with that, and it led to like a subsequent apology and that particular sub-editor or editor was fired. Now, why is that an important example? It might sound almost like ordinary, but it's small precedents like that set or chart a course forward where the public see the power behind their level of access to technology, and specifically when they gather around like an idea or a hashtag or a moment in time to express themselves, and seeing what that tidal wave can do. I think it's Sudanese entrepreneur Mo Ibrahim who, I'll paraphrase a quote that I heard him say, or that's recorded that he spoke of, that there's a certain point after which, a certain threshold after which mobile penetration, should it cross that in an African country, it begins either to threaten or to challenge the very idea of a dictatorship or the absence of democracy. Of course, paraphrase it here, but something to that great effect. And I think when it comes to increasing levels of democracy, it's more importantly, much like Justin spoke to, and Amadou and the whole panel at large, this increase of the flow of information or misinformation, and just greater transparency is really where I think like the lessons can come from. We've seen the media go from gatekeepers, where not only did they print the newspaper, but there was a finite amount of people who could read it and interpret it for a particular group of people, to now where people will choose a variety of sources, are perhaps even slightly more aware of the leanings and inclinations of different publications, left, right, center, or in some cases driven purely by personalities and politics. But I think the one thing that I would say has been very interesting to watch has been the role of the citizen, where the government is saying one thing and the people with a vested interest in whatever outcome are saying another, and people will look to, I wouldn't call them an influencer, or just a digital voice for clarity. I think if you followed the Egyptian revolution in 2011, it's been documented well amongst other people. The work of, I think, a gentleman who's here at the conference too, Andy Carvin, and how, like his Twitter feed in particular, and how he was able to curate different sources and conflicting sources of information and present one timeline for you to walk through. I mean, even with Westgate, there was a very similar example with a local blogger who, it's literally on the record now, when the government said the siege is over, people refused to believe them. When the terrorists would not tweet anymore, people refused to believe them, until this one guy said, as I understand it, that siege is over. That's when people would let out the sigh of relief and say, it's done. So when you see precedents like this set, it puts, like I said, in motion a time where freedom of expression and at least this democracy of information changes not only us, but hopefully the world. Yeah.
I think we may have time for questions from the public, if there is someone who wants to intervene. Yes?
Please. Sorry. Raju from News Corp. Can each of you give one example of something new in journalism in Africa that gives you hope, other than the examples you already talked about? Just one each.
Other questions?
So I'll maybe kick off, and I'm speaking here to something that I'm passionate about. But we're seeing the rise of technology and the ease of communication has kick-started massive cross-border collaboration on investigative projects, which was previously very difficult, and also because of competitive issues with media collaborating with kind of non-aligned media companies was almost impossible in the past. Now people are realizing that because you're working with such large data sets, and also that the world is so interconnected, we're seeing a lot more collaboration. And these projects aren't very expensive, but are producing ongoing, almost evergreen results. Things around arms, the arms industry, pharmaceutical industry, money flows, especially illicit money flows. And that's really exciting because it's building a foundation of not just collaboration, but of joint or co-investment into building journalistic tools.
Maybe just real quick, one is the example that I said earlier, which would be great for you to check out, that of Chief Karaoke, the Kenyan chief, it's basically, if you think social media has done anything to the world, imagine social media sans a smartphone. So without a smartphone, just that, it's an exceptional story of how far I think it can go. The second is missed call technology. On a continent with 99% people prepaid, there's some fantastic ideas, none of which are scaled, but around just using missed calls to invite participation. And those two things, some that I'd be excited to see what happens this year.
I mean, if there's one thing that I didn't mention earlier, which I thought to mention, so the various things that we've been talking about, and one of the big trends that we see is that a lot of the new technology in different ways that is becoming available is a lot cheaper to operate and more practical to operate, but it's cheaper to operate than old technology. So if you take the example of a good friend of Amadou's and others who set up a newspaper in Lagos in, I think, 2007, and it was a very well-regarded newspaper called Next. I think it was the best paper in Nigeria while it was publishing, but the costs of producing the paper, printing it up, running the generators to keep the plant operating and so on, and then trying to distribute it physically across poor roads were huge, and the paper closed. Online, via mobile, that journalism can continue. And that, if I see one trend, I mean, it's something that you do see in the US and elsewhere, of sort of newspapers that are struggling to maintain printing costs and so on. But I see that step, as Justin talks about Africa being an early adopter of many of these technologies. These are for practical reasons, that it might be tough to print up a newspaper and distribute it around Italy or the UK or where have you. It is extraordinarily hard in Zaire, let's say, in DRC, where the road network is obviously extremely poor. So one of the greatest change I see in that way that's a positive sign is the ease of accessing audiences and audiences accessing media, because it's cheaper, tackling one of the big problems, which is the financial constraints that all media houses worldwide face.
Thank you. I think that's, that gives me an opportunity to stress one aspect I mentioned earlier. And I think what really makes me hopeful in rebooting this journalism to keep, is the realization by media owners mostly. And when I say media owners, these are also operators. These just be CEO of the media news organization or the managing director. So it's the realization that ethics is critical into the media houses and journalism staying relevant in the face of the emergence of all these new information communication technologies. So that's actually what gives me hope. And this is actually even way before this realization and movement started, way before the news of the world collapsed in the UK, which were all brought down by purely lack of ethics within the profession.
Thank you very much. We need to free the room. I want to thank all the speakers for having brought a different perspective, even for those who were not born in the African continent. And thank you, everybody, for having me here.